Started, and I want to welcome everyone to this joint geopolitical webinar. It's hosted by the IWF, the Women's Forum of New Mexico, and the Board Risk Consulting nonprofit group. There are members and clients of both on this Zoom, as well as a few guests. IWF members from other countries and states are also joining us, so a special welcome to them. I'm Catherine Allen. I'm a member of IWF and past president in New Mexico. I'm also the founder of the Board Risk Committee nonprofit. We're joined today by an outstanding panel of experts on geopolitical issues surrounding the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and nuclear nonproliferation. In fact, just in prep for this before, we were laughing about you have to have your phone in your hand every 15 minutes because there are new things that have just happened. Ambassador Deborah Jones is a career diplomat and served as ambassador to both Kuwait and Libya after the deadly attack on Benghazi. She was in Iraq during the Iraq-Iran War. She most recently chaired the Mid East think tank and currently chairs the Hollings Center for International Intelligence. She lives in New Mexico and is on the board of Global Santa Fe. Retired and decorated CIA operations officer and former Marine, Douglas London served in the Middle East and Russia. He's a professor at Georgetown University and also still teaches at the CIA. He's a risk consultant and author of the book, The Recruiter, Spying and the Lost Art of American Intelligence. He lives in Virginia. Valerie Plame is the former covert CIA operations officer who served in Europe and the Middle East and is an expert in nuclear nonproliferation. She hosts an annual conference, actually one of the best ones I've ever been to, called Lies, Spies, and Nukes. This year it's going to be September the 25th to 27th in Tucson, and Doug is one of her featured speakers. In fact, that's where I met him. She has written 2 books, Fair Game, My Life as a Spy, My Betrayal by the White House, which was made into a movie, and Blowback. She has served on the boards of the Plowshares Fund and Global Zero and lives in New Mexico. Susan Keating will be the moderator for today, and she is chair and CEO of the board of the Board Risk Consulting nonprofit. She's a former CEO of Women Corporate Directors in the National Foundation for Credit Counseling. She's had a long career in banking, serving as CEO of All First, and she's also a member of the IWF South Florida. And I think we have a number of those members on the Zoom today. Board Risk Consulting provides advisory services through a network of experts and practitioners to corporate boards on risk matters like governance, cybersecurity, emerging technologies, and geopolitical risks. We are all deeply concerned about the war in Iran, the potential global energy crisis, the threats of nuclear weapons, the destabilization of the global order, and the role that diplomacy plays. Please join me in welcoming this auspicious panel to provide us with some insights on how to make sense of what is happening, and in particular, what we might do. Thank you all for being with us, and I'll turn it over to Susan. Again, please everyone would go on mute and appreciate that. Put your questions in the chat and we'll be monitoring them. We are recording this also. Thank you so much. Susan?
Thank you, Kathy, and welcome everyone. This is an incredibly challenging time. And as some of us were talking earlier, it's head spinning. Every hour, every minute, there's another development. So just even having these expert, incredible, experienced people talking about geopolitical issues, we're just scratching the surface. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So I'm going to, first of all, start with Ambassador Jones and ask you, Deborah, give us a little history and a framework for better understanding the Iran-U.S.-Israeli conflict and really the impact of all of that in the Middle East, if you will.
Sure. And since we have only an hour, this is going to be the Reader's Digest version. So forgive me if I make this real kind of simplistic. U.S. can't seem to quit the Middle East for all kinds of reasons. And the two largest ones really emerged after World War II. And that is around energy and hydrocarbons, because the powers that won the war in World War II realized that war had become industrial and that you really needed to have a lot of access to energy to power your defense machines, your defense systems, but also your economies after the war. The second thing that happened after World War II was, of course, the creation of the State of Israel. And the State of Israel in the Middle East, in a place that has all of the hydrocarbons as well. And at the time, remember, this was before the United States was fracking. And even now, even though we are the world's largest producer of oil, still more oil goes through the Strait of Hormuz than is produced in the United States, all told, and much of the world depends on that. And I think all of you have been reading about how oil is fungible, and those of us in New Mexico still see $5.50 a gallon, even though we are a gas and oil producing state in the Permian Basin. It's just the way it works, and that's a different issue for a different day. But those two events, those two developments in the Middle East have both created, put us dependent in some ways. And since the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's meeting with Abdulaziz ibn Saud at Great Bitter Lake, where in fact the first arrangement was made with the US and the Saudis to sell oil in petrodollars. That was a later arrangement in the 80s. I think it came in 81, Doug, and you can correct me on that one, but I think that's when we went to that. But also, it's one of the reasons why we have our Naval Central Command in Bahrain, because Bahrain was the place where oil was first discovered in commercial quantities in the Middle East region. Of course, some of you will know, and that's a whole other conversation and fun story about oil in the United States, why we talk about barrels of oil, which were actually based on whiskey barrels in Pennsylvania, nothing to do with how oil is stored or shipped now. It's fed into big tankers, as you all know now, which tankers are being held up in the Strait of Hormuz predictably. Then how does this all intersect? So let's go back post-war, and you have the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which is in Iran. And you have Iran that is ruled by a Shah that we like, or that works well with the British. And they democratically elect a prime minister, Mossadegh, democratically elected. I want to be clear on that, because this is the case. Well, the British were very unhappy about the fact that Mossadegh decided to nationalize oil in Iran. And so the British got together with us and we have Archie Roosevelt. You'll recognize those names, family names in the United States. They decided the way to do this, and I'm going to let, if anyone on Doug's side or Valerie's want to go into this more, but Archie, we were up to a lot of shenanigans. We did a lot of things. But anyway, we helped and orchestrated the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran. And the Iranians have long memories, like the Chinese do, like everyone else does, and like we do, actually. It's just that we have a short history, but we never forget when something has been done to us either. But it's just that we have less time to go back on it, or we think everyone else should get over these things. So you have that on the one side. So the Iranians already have a beef with us at the time. And then we have the restoration of the Shah, as selected by the United States. I mean, this is a good guy. We can work with this guy. We replace the Shah in Iran. It starts out okay, as most of these things do with autocratic leaders. They're good guys. They look at how they can improve certain things. And then it always tends to take a turn. And soon enough, you have Savak. And you have people who are really repressed, and you have the haves and the have-nots. I mean, this is a pattern we've seen, whether it's in Libya, Iraq, and many other places. And then what happens, so there are uprisings, there are problems, and you have the Iranian Revolution in 1979. You also have something else happen dramatically in 1979 that they all tie in. You have an attack in Saudi Arabia on the Great Mosque, and it's by extremist, Islamists. And so you have suddenly the kingdom, which is also our oil safety place, is also under threat. At the same time, you have this revolution in Iran, and we all know, because we all remember very well, that American diplomats were taken hostage in Iran by a lot of students who were very unhappy, and they wanted the revolution. They wanted to be rid of the Shah. They were angry at the United States, but they didn't quite have in mind what they ended up with Khamenei, and the way that the revolution went in a very conservative, very extreme form of Islam. And I would also say, though, that Um, it's interesting, a side note, again, as you watch the revolution now, and I don't know how many of you have been watching the Legos series that the Iranians have been putting out, the young people. But I think what's fascinating to watch right now is that with the decapitation of the old leadership and with this wartime, it's actually having an impact in Iran on a kind of a liberating. You see young women out in the street again, riding motorcycles uncovered. You see this kind of humor that is being exported. I think it's going to be very hard to put the cap back on, the lid back on, no matter what happens there. But anyway, so you have that thing, that we've taken the shot and they've regret, and so that's where that kind of goes. But also, let me tie this back into Israel, in a way, because Iran is known also. We talk about Hezbollah, we talk about Hamas and the Houthis. And Iran is very famous for using its cat's paws in the Middle East, to use these groups to disrupt their governments and things. But here's the deal: you cannot look at Hezbollah without looking at Palestine and the displaced Palestinians, and the fact that, the way I look at it from a point of view of physics, I'm not going to get into the theology of all of this, which is very deep, but when you have we all know what happens when you have a free electron in physics. It disrupts. And when you don't have a Palestinian state or place for Palestinians to live and to work side by side, you can just follow the pattern in the history of disruption. So whether it was in the 67 war or 68 when they went to Jordan, and then in 1970 you have Black September in Jordan, and the Palestinians are moved again, they're moved over to Lebanon. And in 1982, you actually have, because there's fracturing in Lebanon going on, but you have a Christian Lebanese militia attacks a bus of Palestinian refugees, because they're very unhappy about having too many Palestinians there too, and the disruption of it and the imbalance in these societies. And Israel goes in. You have Sabra and Shatila, which I think many of you will be familiar with, in the massacre that took place in a Palestinian refugee camp, carried out by Lebanese militia, but allowed in the minds of many by Israel. But Israel also takes the opportunity to go into Lebanon. So, there are two different things here. Lebanese may not want Hezbollah there, but they don't want Israel there as well. But as long as you have this kind of floating element and this kind of instability, these things tie together, because, of course, Iran makes a big deal of saying we support the Palestinians. And so one of the reasons it has been argued, and I'm going to go quickly and shut up on this, that Iran has attacked, for example, the UAE more than any other state in the GCC, is because the UAE has signed the Abraham Accords and has been deeply strategically engaged with Israel in terms of national security and other things. So it all kind of gloms in. If you want to know more, though, about the Shia and the Sunni problems, I highly recommend Kim Gaddis's book, Black Wave. We don't have time on this to go into all these other things, but it's a big mosaic. But those are two big issues that keep us there and cause this intersection of problems, and then causes Bibi Netanyahu, over many presidents, because he's been around for a while, to consider the existence of Iran and its nuclear program an existential threat to the state of Israel. And he has pushed, Donald Trump was not the only president that he has tried to encourage to go in. This is a long story, and Netanyahu, even in speaking openly to the US Congress, has said, if we can only change Iran, transform it, get rid of this, the region will be fine. But we heard this talk before. He also thought if we could only transform Iraq and make it democratic and nice and make it all look like us, all of our problems in the region would end. And we've probably said about other places as well. But we tend to be, anyway, we can talk about strategy later, which is non-existent in this war that any of us can see. It's kind of a one day to the next, this is what I think I'm going to do. And we've heard many reasons for the war. I think we're down to now with this, the president realizes Iran's real nuclear power was closing the Strait of Hormuz, not to themselves, but to everyone else. And so I think that's got to be the first thing that they clean up. And the second, and nuclear is going to have to go to negotiations, to remove the enriched uranium, and then the rest will follow. long
Well,
time.
and Deborah will get into nuclear with
Yeah,
Valerie, but
exactly.
let's now, I'd love everybody to hear Doug London's perspective on just what is Russia's role in all of this. And again, Doug, you're such an authority on Russia. Thank you for joining us. And just so everybody knows, he's in the UK right now. It's a little bit later than it is here. So, but thank you, Doug. What is Russia's role in all of this, and how do Russia and Iran perceive the U.S.?
Thank you, Susan, very much. Thanks for including me, and appreciate everybody coming online. Thank you, Susan, for not mentioning that I also just came from the pub before I got back to my room in England. A little bracer doesn't hurt. So, I'm going to actually start with Iran, and I'll get to Russia if you don't mind, because I want folks to have one takeaway, at least from my perspective, on how Iran is looking at everything. So that takeaway is the Iranian regime is created for regime preservation. That is the most important feature to that regime. Not what happens to the country, not the damage it sustains. And it is a revolutionary regime. The IRGC, which we talk about all the time, the I does not stand for Iran, it stands for Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. So a revolution needs an enemy. You cannot make concessions with an enemy and say you still have a revolution. So the legitimacy that the Iranian regime has is based on being at a constant state of war with principally the United States and Israel. It is a movement. So the regime is not in a position really to have great flexibility in making concessions to its principal enemy, particularly those that would undermine that credibility for being a revolutionary regime, which justifies the suffering, repression, economic hardships, and such that the Iranian people go through. Iran is a country of 90 million people. Probably, roughly oversimplifying, about 10 million of those people are with that regime, have access to weapons, force, and power, and profit one way or another by the regime's preservation. 10 million people with guns can sort of take care of 80 million people who don't. For the years since the revolution in 1979, United States planners, regardless of political affiliation, have held on to hope that there will be a popular revolution. Iranians are very nationalistic. They're Persians, cultured, educated, and we watch thousands of people marching in the streets, tens, 20s of thousands of people, and we go see the revolutionary action is in place now to topple the regime. 10, 20, 50,000 does not worry the regime compared to many, many millions. And since they're a movement that actually has undermined nationalism as a way to consolidate power, they take no concern about Iranian casualties. They would rather live, the regime, in a hermit kingdom than make concessions. And they have watched history, and they know history, and they've seen autocracies make concessions to their people or to the West. I'm thinking Ambassador Jones about Libya among them, and seeing it didn't work out well for Gaddafi to make concessions. It doesn't work well for autocrats to make concessions. So we are now entering the negotiation phase. The president has presented basically a one-page paper to the Iranians, which is being negotiated largely in the public eye. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that the Iranians agreed to took 2 years, and it was all done in the shadows. And that way, the Iranians didn't have to feel like they were making compromises in public. So I think it's a challenging road to think that the ceasefire that might be achieved will do anything but achieve a temporary ceasefire, since the reasons the president said we were attacking Iran in the first place are not even part, really, of that immediate ceasefire. So I'll pause there so we make sure everybody has a chance to talk. But again, takeaway, regime preservation. That's all they care about, regardless of what else happens to the country.
So, Doug, just take a minute or two and speak to Russia's role in this, because I
Thank you,
think
Susan.
just a minute or two, and we'll come back again and then talk about
So super quick for Russia, it's a double-edged sword here. they've benefited financially, reaping the profits of lowered sanctions, high demand, and the oil and gas they are selling. So big influx of money. But on the other hand, for Putin, it is a tremendous loss of prestige and credibility. The Russians got run out of Syria. The Russians could do nothing for the Iranians to stop the United States or Israel. They could provide intelligence. They may be able to provide some technology for weapons, but they look like a paper tiger. For Putin, that's a big deal. The money's important, but if the money mattered so much to Putin, he wouldn't have gone through the war in Ukraine in the first place and sustained the tremendous losses. So I think it's a real double-edged sword for Putin. He's not just happy about the money. He's thinking, this makes us look pretty weak.
Thank you so much, Doug. And Valerie, what is today's global nuclear threat? I mean, what's really going on here? And what is the real threat from Iran in all of this?
Of course. Thank you first to Susan and Kathy for having me here today. It's an honor. I'm going to briefly discuss the evolving and escalating global nuclear threat, which focuses on the alarming reality that 7 out of the 9 nuclear-armed countries are currently under authoritarian rule. And there's a real nuclear threat posed by Iran. So I want to start with a snapshot of the world's nuclear-armed nations. There are 9 recognized: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. A quick aside, because this was just raised the other day in a public forum. US intelligence believes that Israel assembled its first nuclear weapon just before or during the Six-Day War in 1967. Israel has never publicly acknowledged its possession of nuclear weapons. They now have an estimated 90 weapons that can be delivered by planes, missiles, submarines. Interestingly enough, just 3 days ago, 30 members of the House of Representatives sent a letter to Secretary Rubio asking a very simple question. Why do administration officials refuse to answer questions about Israel's nuclear capabilities? This is critical to know if we are to make a credible risk assessment about the escalating dangers of the war with Iran. But that's an aside. Of those countries that I mentioned, only the United States, the United Kingdom, and France are considered democracies. And I think it's fair to say that many believe that the United States is moving in an authoritarian direction. The others, Russia, China, North Korea, Pakistan, India, and Israel, have authoritarian regimes in place or are marked by significant demographic deficits and centralized control. What happens is concentration of nuclear weapons in the hands of authoritarian governments raises major concerns about transparency, stability, adherence to international norms. Since the dawn of the nuclear age, we've always been told that democracies would never deploy a nuclear weapon offensively, only defensively. And current events turns this logic on its head. Because authoritarian regimes lack robust checks and balances, debate, oversight, this means that decisions about the use of nuclear weapons can be made by a small group of leaders or even a single individual, which of course substantially increases the risk of miscalculation or escalation. For example, in the United States, we have a policy called sole authority. That is, only the President of the United States has the authority to launch nuclear weapons. He or she does not need to confer with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, nor Congress. This policy is a throwback to a time when communications were not instantaneous, and we wanted to be able to respond quickly in the case of a so-called bolt out of the blue. That's not the case now, and sole authority, in my mind, should be thrown in the rubbish heap. Now, let's turn to Iran's nuclear ambitions, and they have been a source of international anxiety for decades. They've been a malign influence for a host of reasons in the international community since their 1979 revolution that overthrew the Shah. As Doug pointed out, the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, was signed after years of very careful negotiations by experts. And it absolutely curbed Iran's nuclear program. It put it into a box with very intrusive inspections. But since the U.S. unilaterally withdrew from that agreement in 2018, Iran has resumed and accelerated its enrichment of uranium. Obviously, nuclear-armed Iran, with what we now believe are even more hardliners in charge, would not only destabilize the Middle East, but would trigger a regional arms race as other countries feel compelled to seek their own nuclear deterrence. Our intelligence assessments after the joint US-Israeli bombing of June last year and the recent war, we now believe that Iran's ability to produce nuclear weapons has been severely disrupted. However, they still have approximately 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium stored in deep underground granite caverns that remain safe from US and Israeli bombs. They now, this is the assessment, could probably produce a nuclear weapon in about a year. There are only 3 ways to solve the Iranian crisis: diplomacy, sanctions, and war. And only one of these 3, diplomacy, has worked thus far. So where does this leave us? The world is facing a new era of nuclear risk, not just from the traditional Cold War superpowers, but increasingly assertive, secretive regimes, China, AI, hypersonic delivery missiles, a whole bunch of things. The international community has to reinvigorate diplomatic efforts, reinforce non-proliferation treaties, of which none are left, except for non-proliferation treaty, and support dialogue. The stakes are higher than ever. And I'll leave you with this. No matter what your concerns might be, from immigration reform, climate change, affordability, none of those will be solved, and none of those will matter if we don't get the nuclear calculations right.
Thank you. It's a pretty terrifying time. Appreciate that.
You can have a drink
input
now.
on that. Oh my gosh. So, Valerie, you mentioned the autocracies and what's going on in the world here, but also what I'm really curious, why, and Doug, Deborah, join in here, why the growth of autocracy and populism? What's happening to get all of this kind of growing and being as significant as it's become?
I'll just take a quick stab at it. Great question. Everyone's at every. The answers are myriad. One, I believe, is that democracy has not really delivered on, there's that whole abundance theory, which was put out last year in a book by Ezra Klein and another author. I won't go into that, but at the same time, our trust in institutions, whether they're international or national, has severely eroded. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that, not least of which is the rise of social media, which turns out, other than their original vision of the founders of all of that, which they thought would bring us closer, has in fact divided us further. And we can talk about Russian influence in the elections. I'll let Doug do that. But there's just been so many factors chewing on us that I think in times of stress and change, people generally are looking for a strong leader because they're scared.
Doug,
yes. Yeah, I was going to jump on, and I think Valerie got us off to a great start. So I'm here at a conference with a number of our European friends and colleagues and what have you from across Europe, including Northern Europe and such like that. And the common denominator, as we're here in England and they're having local elections, is fear, is the big driver for populism that Valerie very correctly speaks to. Makes a strong person very appealing, somebody who'll correct the woes, who'll protect them, who'll get things right for them. Here they're fearful of immigrants, very similarly to what the message we hear from the White House at home. So the idea that make you scared and we'll come in and be strong and solve it resonates with people based on just what they're seeing. So, and I won't like look internally at the United States, but looking externally, as people see their ability to handle the economy struggling, they need someone to blame. And the immigrants really are a terrific scapegoat for them. And the right across the globe and the populace really leveraged that, I think, quite well.
Deborah, any thoughts on this? I think we lost her at one point, but I thought she was Deborah Jones. Are you with us? We lost her, and then I think she came back
She
again.
came
Oh, there
back.
she is. She's back. Okay.
It
You're
may
on
be
mute now.
because we need to unmute her because she was a participant. So when she came back in. So Deborah, I think we can unmute you.
I just think maybe Ambassador Jones was so depressed after hearing
I
what
was.
Valerie and I said that
Exactly. No, oh no. Oh, for God's sake.
You're
I'm
on.
here. I'm back. I'm back. No, my whole system froze, so I had to go back out and come back. I agree with everything that's said. I mean, I also think that COVID did tremendous damage to the way that people, that kind of isolation. I don't think we should underestimate the impact that COVID had on institutions and faith in institutions, and also just Americans' ability to work with one another. And I agree completely, Valerie, the whole, the physics of the cell phone, which is, again, force equals mass times acceleration. The electron accelerant in the hands of the masses creates a force that is really almost ungovernable now. And I think it's not surprising. I mean, I know that our president is looking for legacy more than, he can't be reelected. He's lame duck and he can't do a lot of other things. But let's be honest, all presidents are tempted by foreign affairs and dabbling in other places. I mean, we have this extraordinary military in the United States. It is one of the institutions, and even that is struggling. And I think, Doug, you mentioned before, or you've mentioned elsewhere about how we've been using up our supplies, and we do see problems, in the military. But there's no question but that the U.S. has the most powerful and capable military in the world. And so it's a temptation to use it as a tool again, and to go out and fight dragons overseas, and because it's just too darn difficult to deal with the problems at home. And especially, we are huge. Again, Iran, 90 to 93 million, it's a headache for us. We're 35 million now, people from all over in all kinds of systems. It's a real difficult thing. And I think that this is going to be one of those times again where we look at ourselves and we may have to go more local, to get things done and kind of change the way that we look at things. But I think that the authoritarian urge is strong, but I don't think it's going to work out, to be honest.
Well, and I'm curious, I mean, we talk about, Doug, you're an authority on Russia, I mean, Middle East, Valerie and Deborah, who are the biggest threats? Which autocrats and which countries are the biggest threats to us? Who should we lose sleep over?
Ourselves first, Susan. No. And I'm not kidding. I think that we have more potential to do damage to ourselves than anyone else. The Chinese are patient. They're competitors. Russia is a second tier power. But again, if we don't have, as your mama used to say, it takes a lifetime to build a reputation and a minute to lose it. And if we lose our soft power, our ability to influence people, to unite people, which is the role of a hegemonic state. And we were seen as a benign, as a positive hegemon. Now we're seen as a predatory hegemon. And that creates a lot of problems for us elsewhere.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'll jump in if that's okay. I would submit to you that if you look at that question really clinically, you start out with, well, who can present an existential threat to the United States? And who could literally destroy the United States? And so you've got Russia and you've got China, even North Korea kind of pops up there because they have nuclear
North Korea
weapons.
too, sure.
Right. So any power that could literally end the United States, that's sort of for traditionally the national security apparatus looks at those, and that's traditionally how the United States ranked those threats since the end of World War II. So I mentioned to you all before we came on that the president's counterterrorist strategy was just released yesterday. It's an interesting read. But it really throws a lot of that on its head from purely the counterterrorist point of view and saying, well, the biggest threat we have is to the homeland. And that's essentially true. But when I think of the threat to the homeland, I think of Russian nuclear missiles, Chinese nuclear missiles, and such. But narcotics and cartels is now the number one terrorist threat in our current strategy, which by doing that requires a realignment of resources, and not just from other terrorist threats, but also from Russia and from China and even from Iran. So I think one of the challenges for the national security community and the military and the folks that have to implement the president's policy is understanding that, okay, we are required to start realigning and diverting resources, but we've got to be prepared to deal with a country that could wipe us off the face of the earth. Now, in the case of the Iranians, they're a pain. Their malign behavior, as both the ambassador and Val were saying, is dangerous to our interests, but it's not an existential threat. Terrorism, terrible World Trade Center. I'm a New Yorker. Awful casualties, not an existential threat. They need attention in the proper order, but where we are, at least to kind of bring us back to Iran, is there's a Persian phrase, and I would botch it up, but it kind of translates loosely to Iran is easy to swallow, hard to digest. What that reflects is an Iranian way of thinking that is asymmetrical. They're used to dealing with bigger, stronger enemies. They just need to survive. And certainly, if you get back to my first suggested takeaway that all they care about is regime preservation, they could survive, where the United States needs a much more tangible outcome of victory, which probably would start with accomplishing what the president said we attacked Iran to do in the first place. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Oh, you're muted, Susan.
Any further thoughts from your perspective, Valerie?
I will just riff off of Deborah's remarks. So there's two buckets, right? What Doug is talking about is truly existential threats. But what keeps me up at night is how we are at each other's throats in this country. The rule of law is being brought into question. It's been overused word, weaponized. Doesn't matter which side of that equation you're on. It is not justice. Whole segments of our government has been hollowed out. And you can have a very good conversation about the value of that, waste, fraud, and abuse. No one's against that. That said, this is just me talking. When I look at what our defense budget is proposed to be, I can't help but think of, like, what's all that defending? All that money, and we can't even conceive of how many billions that is being put forward for what are we defending here in America? I mean, we could be North Korea that puts everything into its defense and the people are eating grass. I'm not saying we're going to eat grass, but you get what my point is, that we are destroying what makes America unique and special. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why, but that's my big concern. So that's the second bucket.
Well, and I'm curious what the impact is of the US also alienating our allies and NATO. Any thoughts on that from the three of you? I mean,
I'll jump on it only because it's been a
Deborah?
topic of the conference I've had the last couple of days. But Deborah, the ambassador could go ahead. That's fine.
You have to
She's
unmute
on
her.
mute. You're on mute, Deborah.
Okay,
Deborah?
now, because I can't unmute myself again. What I was going to say is one thing that we're definitely seeing, Susan, is that our former allies, again, who are kind of still trying to figure out how to deal with us, are now approaching what's called, strategic autonomy. Instead of alliances, they're looking for how they're going to live, survive, work with other people, making arrangements and it's not that they would prefer to have an arrangement with China. And I'm not only talking about the Europeans, but I'm talking about the Gulf states and others who have worked with us. They don't know what to think of our assurances anymore, because our assurances don't seem to be followed up with actions. And we are not even making the assurances anymore. And that's what I mean when I say we're seen as a kind of a different kind of a hegemon now, and not a very nice one, where people were prepared in the past. They all knew that the deals cut our way at the end of the day, that the United States still came out on top. I think we still have, what, 27% of the world's economy. And we are a huge producer and stuff, but they're now being forced to say, you know what, we have to look elsewhere. We have to make other alliances. We have to hedge our bets. It's like everyone in the financial world, they're hedging, and that's what's happening now too. And that will have an impact on our alliances and our ability to operate in places. Sorry, Doug, if you wanted to go back.
No, that's I totally agree, Deb. The one thing I would say though, and especially I'm here among all our European friends, is at the end of the day, there's a lot of anger and emotion, and certainly people have to have plan B and plan C and D, but there's still mutual need. Even look at the Kurds. I mean, how many times have the Kurds had heard broken promises? Multiple times in my lifetime. The 90s, the first Gulf War, the second Gulf War, Iraq, CT, the Islamic State, but they keep coming back because there's really not a lot of alternatives. The same thing really for the Gulf states. The Gulf states, my biggest surprise in this conflict is the Gulf states bought into it. And they did. They can say what they will now, but Kuwait, not the Saudis as much, but the Kuwaitis, the Qataris, and the Emiratis were like, yeah, go ahead, United States, we're behind you. They had to do that. We had to secure that permission for all the military maneuvers, had to prepare them defensively. I feel for the poor Omanis who are like, what did we do? And they're getting shot at as well. But I think, it's not like the Chinese are going to come in and save them. The Russians are a paper tiger. Even when the Gulf states start cutting military deals with China, for example, it's more to fill in the gaps what they can't get from us. But at the end of the day, China's not going to come save them from Iran. The United States may or may not, but there's a better chance of us doing it, certainly than the Chinese or the Russians. So I think in a lot of ways, the fact that we're still the best game in town makes this transactional arrangement, as opposed to these institutional, enduring alliances, why it's still going to at least work for the near term.
Excellent. Valerie, any thoughts? Or Deborah?
Just, no, Doug and Deborah captured it beautifully. Personally, I just find it embarrassing how we are perceived on the world stage. Our credibility has been shot through, and how this administration speaks about our allies. And then there's a big surprise when they're not there when we ask them to be.
Right.
So,
and I do think, Doug, I don't know, we're talking to different people, I guess, in the region. I do think there's a split I think the Kuwaitis are very unhappy, but they have no recourse. These are all neighbors of Iran. They live right there. And they have always relied on the United States. Look, the last thing these guys want, be honest, is for Iran to be a normal state that we have a relationship with, because they're densely populated. They have a lot of resources. They're highly cultured and educated. And, when you take that as a partner, as compared to, and it used to be the old Baghdad Pact, Turkey, Iraq, and Iran, and all of that, they would actually be far more beneficial partners in some ways than our relationships with, especially now that we produce our own oil, but they also produce a lot of hydrocarbons themselves. And I think that, Oman was really betrayed and shafted, because they were right in the middle of negotiations with the Iranians and stuff. And we kind of just, we don't need to worry about you. And they're not big oil producers either. And we really don't have significant bases there. We have basing arrangements through other bases that they have there. Kuwait is existentially dependent on us, or saw itself as that way, even though the Kuwaitis have moved from that now too. And they say, you know what, you saved the French and the Belgians, but they don't have to kiss up to you on everything. And we should be allowed to be independent our own little way. But of course, okay, keep talking, Kuwait, on that. The Saudis are kind of, they're hedging also in another way. And I think that that's a curious one to me. I think they've gone back and forth on go all in. Definitely the Emiratis and the Bahrainis go all in, go get them back, fight them back, do this kind of thing. But it's a delicate balance for those guys as well. And they have their I think what this has effectively done is, if there was any notion that the GCC states had some kind of unified security, which they've never had, the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, we've always kind of commented in private about it. This has kind of pulled the fig leaf back off of that. That doesn't really exist. So it's been transformative in that sense.
What about Hungary with Orban, with the election, with his having lost the election? What does that do to the relationships and what's happening in Europe?
Well, I think you already saw that Hungary took a different position in terms of EU loans to Ukraine, which they had been obstructing. I think, Hungary's a bit complex. They still have the person who beat Orban is from his party originally. He just basically parted with Orban. So we'll have to watch and see, does that political outcome mean all of a sudden Hungary's like back in bed with us again, just like the same issue with Slovenia, which turned to a much more populist, sort of Russian-leaning leadership. Of course, he almost got assassinated, the leader of that country. But I think it's certainly a positive sign for us. But I wouldn't get too excited. Simply as I'm sitting here now and elections are going on locally, there is still a wave of populism. It's just a tremendous backlash against here, the Tories. Labor's not doing any better, really, because the war in Iran has only made the economic situation worse here in Europe, where it's about $2 or so a liter of gasoline here. So, my friend filling up his SUV, he said, I had to pay 160 pounds. It's like what, $180 to fill up his gas tank. And, don't, think about crops, because one of the other economic outcomes, it's not just oil that's not leaving the Gulf, it's fertilizer. So we're seeing here already the effects on the food industry with the increased price of diesel, which is where the transportation comes for our food supplies from, trucks and trains and such like that. But now even the lack of fertilizer is going to impact crops. And if that doesn't change real soon, and I'm certainly no agricultural specialist, we're going to run out of time to resolve that issue. That's again going to complicate the global scene, the food scene. So people want to have a bad guy. They've got the United States as well right now. So that might be a mitigating factor.
Yeah. Could I ask you, Doug, because you're there too? I keep, my mind keeps going back to the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, which is when Russia really, like at that time, the USSR, but they really put the clamp on a movement for freedom there. And I just wonder how far they will let things go before they start mucking about internally as well.
I mean, they're mucking about already internally,
Yeah.
and certainly they were very active in trying to support their candidate Orban. But so are we. I think the vice
Yeah.
president, did he travel there?
Mhm.
So they're still very active and busy in that political stage. I mean, here sitting around for the Europeans, they just case study after case study of how they've manipulated with disinformation, misinformation, acts of violence that the Russians will amplify existing genuine media in Spain or the United Kingdom that says, oh, it was an immigrant that did it, and it wasn't. But the Russians are very good at doing that and sowing that kind of election interference. So I think they'll be doing that. They'll be active. The idea that they use active measures, right? Intelligence activities that we would call covert action, blowing things up, election interference, assassinations. They do it very much to stir the pot. And we've seen no reluctance of them to do that, even though at the end of the day, the Europeans, the Americans, we know they're behind it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
And-
and Susan, oh, sorry, go ahead, Valerie. Go ahead.
I
I'm
was
just
just
afraid to
say
shut
that
up.
the whole point of that, of covert action, is to create chaos, thus fear. And what we talked about at the top of this, then you go, okay, this guy Orban, their hope was that, he's a SOB, but at least we know what we got, sort of thing, right? Who knows? I think Orban's defeat was a huge surprise to everyone. And I think lessons are still being drawn. Magar, the winner, who, as Doug said, was previously with the party Fidesz. I think I'm saying that wrong, but I think what we're, as we look at it as a case study, he really focused on the corruption of Orban and his cronies, and that seemed to really hit a nerve.
The nerve. Yeah, but Susan, talking about the chaos though too, and just drawing further out the thread that Doug had started on the on the hydrocarbons, the impact on agriculture. I think it's also important to remember that the Gulf as a space for AI development and for all these other things, and for all these expats who worked there and sent money home to their families. I mean, there is a thread of disruption that starts from all of this that is an unforeseen consequence. Again, and this, to my mind, this is when you go into something as serious as war, or call it by whatever name, love by any other name, war by any other name, and you don't really have a strategic plan, which, I mean, a strategy, this has become a kind of a tactical game. We switch here, we do this, my impulse tells me to do this or do that. No, you should have clear goals, measurable objectives, and achievable objectives, that before you go into it and say, okay, this is what we're capable of doing, this is what we can handle, and these are the unknowns, as Donald Rumsfeld famously said, and look where that ended us up and where it has historically. And yet we just go back again and again and again thinking that we can just change things magically somehow. But this is going to have huge impacts on many things, including immigration flows.
We have a couple of questions here from Dana Bourne in the chat. And first of all, she says, thank you for this excellent panel conversation. But she's pondering, as we all are, number one, how do we write the history of our future? How do we write it and make it correct for our future? What do we need to do?
Simple answer on one of these things is, stay aware of it. Don't be overwhelmed. Get involved locally. I really do believe that local engagement, that we have to go back to our communities and work in our communities to educate young people about what's going on, about our governance. Kids don't even have time to read. They're so distractive right now. And I don't mean to sound like a boomer, a classic boomer, but the reality is that the world is moving so fast for them with information flows and misinformation flows and groups that are dividing. And I really think our salvation is going to come from community, from those smaller groups where you build confidence again and you have reliable neighbors and partners.
Valerie or Doug, any thoughts?
I agree. I think that's the only. Well, not the only, but it's an excellent pushback, because in a chaotic world, which is exactly what, whether it's our administration or across the globe, in that chaos, and news just comes at us so fast, like out of a fire hose, you need to turn off some of that and refocus on cultivate your own garden in your own backyard. What can you do? And so, I wish there was a grand sweeping solution, and we all know there isn't. And since I have the floor, I see her second question, if I might address that very quickly. How do we address Iran's nuclear stockpile, keep the Strait of Hormuz open, and avoid a wider conflict?
That's an easy
that
one.
to Peter Hegseth. And as I said in my remarks earlier, 3 ways: diplomacy, sanctions, and war. Those are the 3 options available. The sanctions, and we kept tightening the ratchet, as Doug thoughtfully said. The only thing Iran cares about, or I should say the regime, is survival. So, they will eat grass. It's fine if they can survive this. War, although we're not in a war, whatever this excursion or journey is, and whatever we call it, that actually will not do anything in terms of one of the justifications given them for this war was the highly enriched uranium that they have stockpiled for nuclear weapons. That's not going to do it. Some of this stuff I learned apparently is so deeply underground that even a nuclear bomb could not it would not destroy it. So I guess does that mean, boots on the ground? I can't even imagine that scenario. The Iranians are not going to say, sure, come on in. It would be, we could not handle the US public could not handle the casualties that would entail. So what's left? Diplomacy, which maybe, a lot of people might scoff at that, but it worked with the JCPOA, and they were in a box, even though it was not the perfect deal, because no deal ever is.
Go ahead, Doug, and then we have a couple of other questions in the chat.
I'll try to be quick. So I think because we have used force, we've lost a lot of our deterrent value. The Iranians have written it out and seen that they could survive. I think what we have is a situation in Iran, which is our worst case scenario, where it's essentially the IRGCs in control with sort of a puppet figure in terms of Mujtaba Khamenei. But one thing I would suggest to you is, as bad as all these people are, it's still not homogeneous. And even among the bad guys, one could try to leverage bad guys against other bad guys. You don't look for moderates, don't look for reformists, but look for somebody who wants power and wants more power and wants a better deal. And I think you do that in complement with some diplomatic action as well, because keeping the Strait of Hormuz short of occupying the islands, which you'd have to do really, because you could use artillery to close down the Strait of Hormuz. Right? Simple artillery would do it, as well as boats and such like that. So there's going to have to be some engagement, but that might be the Iranian gold, silver arrow, that they now feel they do have some deterrent. Maybe they don't need a nuclear weapon because they can simply shut down the Strait of Hormuz anytime they want to. I'll pause there.
Well, go ahead, Deborah.
No, I was just going to say one thing. I think it's important to remember: the Iranians are not crazy. They're not irrational people. I mean, they're surviving. This is an existential issue for them. They know it is not for us, and they are going to do what they have to do to survive. I think that any of this could have been predicted. I think that they will, we've made deals with people, like with the North Koreans and with others. The point is, as I often say to people, the opposite of war is not necessarily peace, it's process. And that's whether it's in your marriage or anything else. In any time you have two humans talking, you can have conflict, but as long as you're talking to each other and you're trying to find ways to work it out, you can move forward. So I do think this is not going to end without some serious conversations about, who wants a given, it's a give and a take, like in anything else. Also, I do want to underscore, since I have been in the State Department, or since I came into the Foreign Service, in 1982 or whatever it is, but as long back as 1994, we were saying Iranians will have a nuclear capability within 2 weeks, or could have. And there's a big leap between having the know-how to have fusion, to have enriched uranium, then to create a bomb, and then on top of that, to create a weapon, to create a deliverable system for it. Because all those things can be interrupted in the interim. And we know that because we deal with nuclear powers all the time, and Pakistan is a nuclear power, and you want to talk about an unstable, regime, or a place that has capability for things to go wild. So I do think with some patience and with some, I think it's the impatience that has really done us in on some of this stuff, and the fact that twice now, it's, what's that old saying? Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Fool me 3 times. Well, then I'm really an idiot. Anyway.
Well, we are getting short on time here.
Sorry.
And there are 3 other, no. We could go on and on. One of the questions has to deal with oil prices and sort of the implications of that and where all that is headed. Another question's, how will the war in Ukraine be resolved? And the other is, what's going to happen if we're perceived as being very pro-Russia? And Caroline our COO, you can email directly any other questions that you have, and we will be sure to get responses back to you. But any sort of final comments on any of those last ones, Valerie, Doug, and Deborah?
Okay, buy your tickets now, because it's not going to get less expensive.
Yeah.
I'm just telling you, that's the reality. And if you look at it, the oil companies, especially like Shell, it's funny because the US oil companies aren't doing so great on this, but they're raising prices even without the prices going up on the market, as they go back and forth. So my advice to you, prices are not going to go down. Buy your tickets now, and you know, buy insurance for when the jet fuel runs out and people have to, you know, cancel flights. But I don't see that. I mean, I don't see prices going down. You know, Ukraine, what a surprise for all of us, huh? Talk about being adept, agile, and creative, and creating an arms industry for the new way of fighting wars, that you're selling weapons to the Gulfies. Now, I mean, you gotta say, you know, chapeau to these guys, but can they defeat? I don't know. You know, we, again, Doug, Valerie, you know, I don't feel like we really know what's happening in Russia. You know, we hear so many different things, and Putin's weak now, and his, you know, he's losing a lot of popular support. And just now I saw the other day, a lawyer, one of his prominent former allies, has criticized him now. And, you know, people there are tired of this war as well. What has it been, 4 years now, almost more?
Well, so we have run out of time. What I'd love to hear, Doug, why don't we start with you, Valerie, and then Deborah, what is your one takeaway that you'd like people to kind of take away from this discussion?
Again, as I started, just try to look at the world the way Iran's looking at it. As you hear all the to and fro about the negotiations, again, Iran's whole purpose in life, their leadership, is to stay in power, and they are not worried as much. I mean, yeah, they love sanction relief, they love to be able to pump money in the economy, but they might have killed as many as 100,000 people when they shut off the internet some time ago. That doesn't bother them. They need to worry about the millions of people coming on the street as opposed to the thousands. So it's Deborah is right. The Iranians are ultimate pragmatists, but they also feel they are winning now.
Okay, Valerie, your thoughts. One takeaway.
If you have an opportunity to speak to any of your elected officials, ask them what their view is on the billions of dollars that we are spending in the United States on our nuclear infrastructure. We're modernizing, which is a euphemism for we're replacing weapons one for one, which is obscene. So educate yourself a little bit and just ask your your elected official, hey, what do you think about that? Is that a good idea? And see them stammer.
Great, Deborah, and then we'll turn it back to our founder, Kathy.
Deborah. No, as I still say, you know, keep your history take the long view. We've gone through all kinds of things before. I will somehow get through this, but it will be a different world. We're not going to go back to the world we were in. We are not going to go back to those 80 years, those halcyon years post World War II from an American perspective. Those days are gone. And I think, you know, we just need to accept that, but then do the best we can. And I'm with Valerie too, you know, get involved with, let your congressman, your reps know what you think, you know, and speak up and get involved locally.
Great.
So thank you, Susan. Thank you, Valerie and Doug and Deborah. This has really been an excellent discussion. And I think my one takeaway is, wow, and what a chaotic world we have. But you also give us a perspective of how to understand not only the history of what's happened, but what are some of the tactics that might work as we go forward. So thank you very much for being with us. Thank all of you in the audience for being with us today from the many places you're coming from. And thank you to the Board Risk Consulting for partnering with us on this today. We look forward to more discussions in the future. And again, have a great week, everybody. And thank you all so much.